I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Natalie Siegel-Brown. Natalie is the Inspector General of Aged Care. Natalie was appointed Inspector General in January this year after almost 3 years as a Commissioner with the Productivity Commission. Her professional life as a lawyer began with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Natalie's specialty is the human rights protection and empowerment of vulnerable people. She has worked across the New South Wales and Queensland governments, leading public policy and service delivery in domestic and family violence, statutory child protection, ageing and disability, and was also the Queensland Public Guardian with statutory oversight for a range of vulnerable persons across areas such as child protection, youth justice, mental health and disability. She was a co-author of a national child sexual assault prevention framework. In more recent years, Natalie was CEO of Childwise, a non-profit organisation building worldwide child-safe practice. Over to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Paul. Gurumba Biggie, everybody. Hello from where I am on Yagara Turrbal country here in Meanjin, also known as Brisbane. Before I start, I also want to acknowledge the country that all of us are coming from and acknowledge ancestors and culture that has for millennia led the way in caring for elders and valuing our elders as such an integral part of our community. I next want to acknowledge you all and thank you all for the work you do. And the very fact that you are here at this webinar demonstrates your passion and commitment to improving care for our culturally and linguistically diverse elders. I realise this is a pretty stressful time for yourselves, for your leadership. Many of us are stressed and struggling to comprehend the road ahead pre-1 November, wondering what it'll look like post-1 November. And I know how hard that is to explain the road ahead to the older people you care for and their loved ones. So in that time of stress, which is natural before any big change, appreciation for what you do can actually get lost. So I don't want that to get lost here. And I want to remind you, you are very, very much appreciated. What we're talking about today has very strong personal resonance for me. I come from an Eastern European background, but I come from a race and religion that has experienced a lot of persecution over many hundred years, and my family ran away to safety in this country. So watching my grandparents move here, unable to speak the language, unable to pursue what they were professionally trained in. They didn't know they were going to be living here. They escaped some horrific stuff during World War II and literally had nothing but the clothes on their back when they moved here, which is a story that is, of course, not uncommon. And I watched my grandparents age in care that was designed specifically for my community, that did promote my identity. And I don't think we would have accessed that care without knowing and having great confidence that my grandparents were going to be so valued, so acknowledged, and amongst other people growing old who shared their language, their belief system, their food, their culture. So sadly, right now, we live in a society where more and more of us from a migrant background are feeling scared. We are increasingly, I think, feeling scared about the sentiment amongst the community around us during some very turbulent times, particularly where we've seen some of the anti-migrant sentiment coming from the marches and the sovereign movement over the last few weeks. And this is an issue around the world, this kind of xenophobia. So today's webinar actually couldn't come at a more important time. So firstly, who needs an Inspector General anyway? Who are we? The concept of my office came from recommendations that were made by the Aged Care Royal Commission. The intention was that my office be set up to ensure constant accountability and oversight for the government's administration and regulation of the aged care system. And so the Act that establishes my position and my independence came into being barely 2 years ago. One of the things that the legislation under which I'm established requires is that I report on how the government has implemented the recommendations of the Royal Commission. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that my first report as Inspector General, so I was appointed back in mid-Jan as the first embedded Inspector General. There was an acting Inspector General prior to that. My first report on the Royal Commission's recommendations was tabled on Thursday in Parliament. So what you see on your screen is a little bit of a summary of my role in very accessible terms. So the legislation asks me to monitor, investigate, and report and review on the current aged care system for on systemic issues for the betterment of the lives of older people in Australia. The way I view the function of my role for the rest of my term is to say, okay, if we are broadly agreed that the new Aged Care Act sets the compass for the system that we want to have, that is one that centres human rights, that treats high quality care as meaning that our identity should be valued and promoted, that we should receive dignified, compassionate, kind care that keeps us as connected to our community and our loved ones as possible. I've been thinking deeply about, well, if that's the vision that we should all share, then how do we make it real? How do we make sure this new Aged Care Act is not just pretty words on a page? So we've set out a strategic framework, which you can find on our website. But essentially what it says is that given that we are an office of 20 people, in order to ensure that this is constantly being delivered by the government and not just mere aspiration, what we need to do is ensure that what work we do is looking at meaningful change. So we're not going to get bogged down in some of the widgets of the system. For example, care minutes is probably not something we're going to be focusing on, but how we can possibly deliver all of these aspects of quality of life and fulfillment when a funding model really just prioritises clinical care at this point. For us, that's a meaningful change. We want to stick to the really high-level transformational things because while the other things are important, we think it's still critical to check that we've actually embarked on that transformation that the Royal Commission asked of us. And that's a question that I really explored deeply in this latest report that I've had tabled. I want to make sure that we can be held as an office to the same level of accountability as everybody else, but also to ensure that by transparency of the system, we are building trust and confidence of people in Australia in the system. Of course, transformation has to happen and be evidenced for people to grow that confidence. And lastly, while of course it is absolutely vital that I call out issues where they lie, in the way the government has administered and regulated the system, which of course would probably be evident to those of you who have had a look at my report. I want to make sure we equally focus on where this is being done well within the sector, whether the policy programs and reforms that we've got are either facilitating that great practice or indeed inhibiting it from thriving. I want to look at where it's being done well in other sectors, and I also want to look at where it's being done elsewhere in the world. I'll just say a couple of things before I briefly go into the report that I've just released on the government's implementation of the Royal Commission's recommendations. I'm not going to dive deeply into the standards. I'll thank my colleague Pat for doing that, and I know she'll do a top job of that. But I just did want to talk a little bit more broadly, raising our gaze above the standards specifically. The Royal Commission, in its final report, treated diversity homogenously. It considered that all forms of diversity, whether it was culturally and linguistic diversity, whether it was sexual and gender diversity, it could all be captured under the term diversity, and the same principles apply in terms of the way we ensure care is responding and is culturally safe for people from diverse backgrounds. However, most of us are from diverse backgrounds, and many of us are intersectional in our diversity. So some unitary principles apply across diversity, but I think that the homogenous approach can miss some critical human rights. So the new standards are vitally important, the new strengthened standards. However, as you will know, there is not a specific standard dedicated to the way we need to be caring for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. There are certainly references to culturally safe care in some elements of the standards, and that's great. But the fact that there's not a dedicated approach here means that the way we apply the standards, it will be up to you to think in a really dedicated way about how you want to tailor your care and make specific efforts focused on not just culturally safe care, but what I refer to as culturally fulfilling care. And I do think that's a requirement of this definition of high quality care that is all about the promotion and valuing of your identity. And really listening and thinking deeply about what it means to reflect my identity in the care that I receive. And that's important to reflect not just at the individual level, but at the organisational level, the care and service level, the environment level, clinical care, food, nutrition, community, all the things that are then encapsulated by the standards themselves. So it will be up to you and organisational leaders to cast your gaze above the horizon and say, how do we go above compliance and really think about what this means for the care of clients from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds? And sadly, as I'm about to share, the Royal Commission found that our existing aged care system does not provide care that is non-discriminatory and appropriately tailored for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The new Act and the reforms don't actually embed incentives or disincentives for providers to deliver this kind of care specifically. There's no mandatory training in culturally safe care, for example. So it'll be up to you and your organisation to really make the mandate for that. So I'm going to chat to you about the aim of the reforms and where I think you could lead the way in this change. But first, I just want to touch on some specifics. Somebody from PCAC, from Partners in Culturally Appropriate Care, said to me in a meeting the other day, we always say it takes a village to raise a child, but actually it takes a village to age well. And that's in particular very resonant for our culturally and linguistically diverse communities. That connection to community is absolutely vital. So home care is particularly important for people to stay culturally connected, especially while we lack so much culturally tailored care. And then very often where people are in a situation where they've got no other option but residential aged care because of the way in which the system is constrained with respect to places, many people have to just accept whatever is available. We don't have quite the choice and control that we might aspire to. So if you have to take a bed that is available because you're desperate, very likely you may not have access to one that is specific to your cultural background, and that experience of going to residential aged care, which is already quite an isolating experience for people, can be even more isolating. And if you, for example, revert to your language of origin or struggle with language, the need to be understood and to try to express yourself can become more difficult. And in some circumstances, I've seen restrictive practices applied where there's actually a problem with communication. So if we think about other sectors where we're looking at restrictive practices, there's a really strong mantra around understanding that behavioural symptoms are a function of communication and not feeling understood or feeling fear and anxiety. And this can be exacerbated in a situation where people are also additionally facing cultural and language communication barriers. So for me, all of that then brings into play this question of this wonderful definition of high quality care in Section 20 of the Act, which has 18 different planks around prioritising your connection to community and culture, your loved ones, your food, promoting and valuing your identity. we're in a really tough situation of saying, well, how do we make sure that's achieved in this particular context, particularly when we know we've got some funding constraints around really a higher prioritisation around full funding of clinical and restorative care, and then it's a different situation in residential aged care as well. We must remember that our workforce is often a very diverse workforce, and I saw on the screen before, some people are ensuring that the workforce they engage is reflective of the people that they serve, and that's wonderful. But where we have culturally unsafe practice, and when we are in a community where the temperature is feeling very alienating to people from diverse backgrounds, we have to think really carefully about how the cultural safety for our clients within our organisation also can serve to support or indeed alienate our workforce as well. So there's some specific things. I would just like to now briefly tell you about some of the specific findings relating to supporting elders from culturally and linguistically diverse care in our Royal Commission recommendations. So, as I mentioned, we've issued a report recently, and the government tabled it in Parliament on Thursday, and it, of course, explores all of the issues in aged care and all 148 recommendations of the Royal Commission. However, we wanted specifically to pick up on issues relating to the importance of particular kinds of care for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So some of those I've already talked about, and these were picked up by the Royal Commission as well, that aged care has to reflect the diversity of people, and that it should be core to the business of aged care. So it is disappointing that we don't see some of these things as mandatory within the system we have now. Of course, there is still time to address these things. But as you can see from the boxes on your screen, these are some of the things that the Royal Commission thought absolutely vital in ensuring we get the right care for our elders from diverse backgrounds. Some good things have happened since the Royal Commission handed down its report. There's a specialisation verification initiative, which is effectively a way that providers can flag to the community that they are indeed specialising in diverse care and that they can substantiate claims to doing so. It's still not mandatory training for staff in those things, and we are still not incentivising and disincentivizing bad practice in relation to culturally safe care. And the government has made an investment in data collection around diverse demographics. However, I've found that really isn't going far enough. So the last thing I wanted to say to you about the report that I've just had tabled in Parliament is that achieving an aged care system where all older people feel respected, understood, safe, feel like their value is up, their identity is valued, that's good for everyone. If we're doing that for people from our culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, that actually really gives an environment of safety and value to all. We still don't have that system right now that mandates non-discriminatory, appropriately tailored care for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And there's a whole range of things that we believe need to happen across the system to mandate that beyond the special verification initiative and beyond data collection. And as you've heard me refer to a few times already, the mandatory training for cultural safety is just absolutely vital.
Thank you, Natalie. We'll now go to our next speaker, Patricia Sparrow. Patricia is the CEO of COTA Australia, the peak body for older Australians, dedicated to creating a future that values and includes people as they age. Her mission is clear: to make ageism as unacceptable as sexism or racism. With a career spanning community services, aged care, disability health and government, Pat brings a broad perspective from frontline experience to policy influence. She has worked across the not-for-profit sector, public service and ministerial offices. At the heart of her work is a belief in the dignity and contribution of older people. She has championed reforms that put control and funding in the hands of individuals, not providers, and continues to advocate for systemic change.
I'm going to talk about standards for diversity, and I know how difficult it was for people when the new Act was being put together. We I know that communities were concerned because they felt that they'd been relegated to a footnote in the Act. We did argue as the Act was going through that we wanted more of a focus on diversity. It's not where we landed, but I think Natalie is right now in terms of technically the footnote means that we're as protected as always, but I think it's now down to all of us to make sure that we really do follow what the Royal Commission wanted with diversity and what I know many of you want in terms of supporting people appropriately. I should give a little bit about COTA. We do represent people over 50. People are a little bit horrified when I say 50 because they don't think over 50 is old. But I don't know if you saw a report a couple of weeks ago. Employers now, recruiters, think anyone over 51 is an older worker. So we find discrimination starts particularly in employment around the age of 50. We've been in the business of supporting and advocating for older Australians since 1958. And our aim is to represent and promote rights, interests and good futures of Australians as we age, which is all of us, because if we're lucky, we're all actually an older person waiting to happen. Some of us are closer to it than others. And we also look across life areas and policies. So our portfolio that we work on is very broad. Aged care is central to that. But we also do work in retirement incomes and in health, in housing, in women's issues. And so some of those things will probably appear today as we're talking. The new standards that you have, I'm not going to go into them in great detail either because I think I want to get you to focus on a different way of looking at them. But we know that there are standards that cover the individual, the organisation, the care and services that are being provided, the environment, clinical care. And I think clinical care has become such a thing in the system because so many of the terrible stories in the Royal Commission were about failures in clinical care, food and nutrition, and the residential community. For me, standard one, the individual, not surprisingly, given the work that we do, is actually critical. And I feel that if you're meeting this standard, you're not going to be too far off meeting a lot of the other standards. And these are the things, I like the way this is worded. These are the things that actually older people would say to us, and I'm sure they say them to you. They want to be treated with dignity and respect, and they don't want to be discriminated against. They want to make their own decisions, acknowledging sometimes they might need support. They want their identity, culture and diversity to be valued and supported and to live the life they choose and to make those choices for themselves. And what they're looking for is providers to understand who they are and what's important to them, and that actually influences the way that the services are delivered. And I think if you think about it on that notion that we're all an older person waiting to happen, I actually think that that's what you would say too. I'm 62. I'm not looking at aged care yet, but that's exactly what I would say. It's what older people say to me. And I'm sure for many of you, it's what your clients say to you. I want to talk about discrimination because ageism is alive and well. More than 1/3 of people in Australia have experienced it. And there are some interesting readings around ageism and cultural beliefs. There are some research and readings that say ageism isn't a feature in some cultures and others that say that it is. And I think what we have to recognise, which is what the standards ask us to do, that we have to take that overlay and look at it. But we really need to look at discrimination, ageism, and making sure that we're not treating people inequitably, which ultimately is what discrimination does. So my plea to you is, as you're going through and looking at the standards and how you actually are going to meet the standards and do better than the standards, as Natalie said, is to think about ageism and to think about how it impacts on how you deliver services. All of the standards, particularly that first one about the individual. And to do that, we need to actually talk about ageism, which is not something we do very often. I do, but many don't. There are 3 different types of ageism that we talk about, and they're important to understand because they all play into how we interact and how we see older people. The first form of ageism is internalised. I'm going to give you some examples of this from my own experience because even if you think you're aware of ageist attitudes, it doesn't mean you're not ageist. And so I'll give you an example for me, 2 clangers that I pulled recently. I'm going to see a doctor, terrific doctor. I came out and I went, well, he was about 12. It's really not relevant. It undermined the skills and experience that he had and the way that he was able to support me. The other one, which is about the way we limit ourselves, is that I was told when I was very young not to let my hair go grey because nobody would listen to a grey-haired old lady. That's an internal monologue I have. I still get my hair, I'm not quite as grey as I need to be yet to let it go, but I still get it done because that monologue's in my head. And that actually makes me think about ageing and older people in a certain way that's not right. We limit ourselves and what we choose to do by thinking that we're too old. You will hear older people say that, I'm too old for that. Or you will make a decision about someone else. And this is where I want to touch on what we do see in aged care and in health services and many services is what is called benevolent ageism. It's not coming from a bad place. It's people wanting to help someone who's older. The Human Rights Commission did some fantastic training in aged care, an hour and a half session on ageism. The workers who signed up to go to it before they went, they said, we don't really need this training. We're not ageist. We work in aged care because we love older people. After an hour and a half, they could identify that actually they were doing things that were ageist and they hadn't realised it because they thought they were being helpful. So one worker said, I realise I actually pretty much yell at everybody because I assume they can't hear me. Other workers talked about the kind of language that they used, things like calling someone love and dear because they thought that would be nice for the person, but all that does is, is patronising to the older person. And I don't know if many of you saw the fabulous Helen Mirren complaining recently that in the street someone walked past her and her husband, both in their 80s, holding hands, and made a comment about how sweet it was that they were doing that. She said they wouldn't do that for any other couple walking down the street, and she found that very condescending. And that's the sort of thing I think we have to be careful not to do. The worst thing that happens with benevolent ageism, they're relatively small kind of examples of things. But what actually that can lead to is that we don't listen to the older person, or that we circumvent them making their own decisions by doing what we think is best for them. And I think we have to really guard against that. And I'm sure that some of you have been in the situation where people do know. You might think about a time. I think about a time I had my son where other people felt that they knew what I needed and were making decisions, and it's hard to speak up. We do that to older people all the time. As I said, it's not coming from a negative place, but it still marginalises them, and it means we're not listening, and it means we deliver services and we design services in a way that works against older people, and that's the sort of thing that I think when you're looking at all of the standards, you need to take that lens. Am I taking people's power away? Am I taking people's agency away? How am I listening to them? How am I hearing what they want? How do I know about them as an individual? How do I know about their diversity? How do I know about their experiences in life that will influence how I deliver care? I'm not saying this is easy, but I am saying I think that if we do this, the services will be better. And there are many good examples, and we saw some of them come up on the slides earlier. There are many ways that we can improve the services that we're doing when we look at it from the point of view of the older person, when we take time to get to know them, when we engage with them. I think that that will really help you to meet all of the standards, which is really why I'm focusing on that standard number one about the individual. The third form of ageism we see is systemic. The best example I can give you of that is in the banking system. I don't know if you realise it's really difficult if you're an older person and you need to borrow money. It's really difficult to borrow money if you don't have an existing loan that you've held on to. That's because the banks don't, for example, treat superannuation as income. So even though people retire and they get superannuation and that's their income, many banks don't treat that as income and won't borrow on the basis of that. So that's systemic. So you can see that when those three things come together, if we limit ourselves and the way we see other people because we internalise a view that ageism or that ageing is not a desirable thing, and we make assumptions about people, which is what ageism is. We make a whole lot of assumptions. The assumptions we hear all the time about older people, they're no good with technology, they will get forgetful, everyone's going to get dementia or Alzheimer's disease. All of those things are not true. And the fact that we design systems and think about it that way is a problem. We take away people's agency when we treat them with benevolent ageism. As said, it's not coming from a bad place. We think we're being helpful, but the end result is we take people's agency away. And then, as I'm saying, we actually create systems that lock those beliefs, actions and behaviours in, which is where we want to get away from. So to me, addressing ageism is absolutely foundational in you being able to meet the standards. And we're very pleased that in talking to government about this, I think ageism is going to be a key thing. And it has to be, because we don't think about it and we don't call it out. It's the most widespread and we don't think about it. So I think it's key to us to meet every single standard is for you to think about this and to think about older people. We need to be aware of it, because we're not doing it generally because we're really nasty people, but we need to be aware. And unless we're aware of it personally and we can have a conversation in the community, we're not going to sort of raise that awareness and see it as an issue that needs to be addressed. As employers, we need you to support that we shouldn't be acting in ageist ways, and we need to call it out, and we need to discuss it, and we need to support people. The great thing about that Human Rights Commission work was that after an hour and a half, people actually could see what they were doing and committed to changing that behaviour. And then 3 months later, when they checked, people had permanently changed their behaviour. So while it's one of the most widespread isms that's there, it's also one of the easier ones to get people to make a shift in. Which is really important. We need stronger discrimination laws. And we do see in the Act a positive duty about rights, but we need to see a positive duty about calling out this. And I think that if we look at that ageism lens all the way through, we'll also come to grips with diversity, inclusion in a much better way. And I'm happy to, because I know we've run a little bit over time, to give some time for questions and answers. So I took the one standard. I acknowledge that there are a whole lot. But I think that if we get this one right, you'll be well on the way to really addressing diversity and inclusion and really making sure that you're meeting where the Royal Commission wanted to go and where older Australians really want the sector to be. Thank you.
Just to get things going, I'm putting out there a question. And this question comes back to cultural and linguistic diversity. Do you think if a provider strategically sets out to attain a high level of cultural and linguistic inclusion in their aged care services, that it will generally help attain high quality for all individuals in that service?
I think what's great when you think about diversity and inclusion is it encourages you to see people as, yes, there are groupings within it, but it really encourages you to see people as individuals and to see that different individuals have different wants and needs in the same way that ageism does. So yes, I think it's really key to being able to drive at the heart of what the Royal Commission wanted to achieve. Obviously, there are a lot of things in the standards that providers are going to need to go through, but I think bringing that focus and that attention to treat people as individuals and understanding them and making sure that if you are supporting people from a particular cultural background or some other form of diversity, that you're aware about what's important to those communities will help you go a long way to meeting the standards.
It won't surprise you that I strongly agree with Pat, and obviously I think I made some allusions towards this when I was speaking as well, that if you get it right in terms of culturally safe and what I call culturally fulfilling care, that means you're going to start really thinking about what is valuable from an identity perspective for everybody. I guess I just would perhaps add that while it might sound obvious, I recognise this is a really big challenge, right? We've got all of these compliance obligations on us, financial obligations on us. There's this big discussion and obsession around productivity at the moment, which sounds like it's all about throughput and getting through things as quickly as possible and minimising the time you spend with people. And that sounds somewhat, at first blush, completely contradictory to the time required to truly get to know somebody's needs, their identity, working with their loved ones to understand what their preferences are, how they best communicate, what food makes them feel safe. And I think that's the stuff that Pat's alluding to there. They are not actually contradictory concepts. Once you get to understand this properly for a person, investing that time up front in getting to know who someone is, what is so valued to them in terms of the way they eat, communicate, engage with their community, the fulfillment of their lives, what you're going to find is that you're actually investing in a kind of care that might be the most efficient care, but also the kind of care that actually prohibits acceleration of cognitive decline, physical decline, and delivers on that beautiful multi-plank definition of high quality care in the Act, which is all about valuing identity.
I am taking that to be that addressing these issues gets at the heart of the matter. It's about a paradigm shift or a mindset change. One of the questions that we have here are any recommendations on how a smaller organisation can meet this standard? And I'm assuming this means standard one, as we don't have access to large training organisations. So maybe this is a question of, does size matter? Or is this something that even a small organisation can commit themselves to?
I don't think size does matter in this. I do appreciate, I don't want to underestimate. I do think, and I've worked with providers in the past. I don't underestimate the size of the challenge, but I think this is something where if you're really sort of investing in knowing the people that you're providing support for, I think that's not dependent on size or training. There are things you do need training on, absolutely agree. And I do think smaller organisations and those in rural and remote areas have difficulty accessing, supports and services. So don't for a moment think that I underestimate how difficult some of this can be. But in this instance, in terms of meeting the first standard and really understanding people and treating people as individuals, I think you can do that whatever size organisation you have. And I know that you'll feel pressured, but I think what Nat said then is right, that it might feel like a big investment up front, but it will pay dividends over time.
This is really a question that more relates to the Aged Care Safety and Quality Commission. The question was, how does the Commission audit the standard relating to diversity? Are there any third-party auditing tools or software that can be utilised? I'd just like to say, from the Centre's perspective, we have a diversity mentoring program. And as part of that diversity mentoring program, we have actually developed a tool called the Cultural Care Compass, and that's used to do a self-appraisal of how you are operating in terms of culturally and linguistic inclusive practice against all 7 of the standards. Another question that we have here is, and maybe Pat, this is for you, but what does an aged care service look like that has really systematically set out to remove ageism?
It is one where people are respected as individuals, and what you see a lot of, and there are some great services, so I'm not saying it's not the case, but I have seen some services where you can tell that the staff really know about the individual and what's important to them, and there's a different vibe in those places when you go in, if I can say the vibe. They don't look significantly different in terms of the sorts of supports they might be providing. What's different is the way they tackle those supports and the way they provide the services to people. So they really think about, there's stories about people who don't like to get up in the morning and providers who will go in and just, it's time to get up and they're on a schedule, and we understand the pressure that you're under. But some services will go in and knock on the door and say, do you want to get up yet? Do you feel like you want to have a shower? And not just assume. So that's a really a polarizing example, but it is true. And we do see, people being sort of almost not dragged out of bed, but come on, you got to get up, got to have a shower, you got to have a shower. Well, I don't know about you, but some days on the weekend, I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to have a shower. And if I don't want to do that till later, and there's no real issue, I don't see why it's an issue. And I see homes that do that much better, that talking to the person when they're going in to deliver a service, not just as an overarching. So there's the overarching piece, but then it's constantly checking with the person about how they are and what they need that day. And again, I appreciate that's difficult, but I think any change that's difficult is usually worth it. And I'm sure that once we make the shift, it will be much easier to do. it'll feel difficult and a little bit false while we're doing it. But if we start to do that and we value people and we respect that people can make decisions, is the other big thing in aged care that I was talking about, really, is not just taking agency away. And yes, sometimes they need support, but really taking the time to understand what the person wants and working with them. And if they do have a supporter or someone who's helping them make decisions with them as well.
I think you've just helped answer one of the questions that was put up, which is, are there any simple examples of good practice that Natalie and Pat could suggest to make care culturally safe? I'm going to get Natalie to answer that in a moment, but one of the things that we're particularly emphasising with providers, and that we're actually going to with our next webinar in October, is around communication. So we feel that communication and use of interpreters is like the 101 of safety. How could we be asking people to sign resident agreements or participate in planning for their own care if we're not using interpreters in those settings? Natalie, do you have any other examples that really stand out in your mind from everything that you've heard when you go around to consult with various stakeholders about the things, or a simple idea, example of an area of practice that makes care more culturally safe?
Thanks, Paul. And I think your Compass tool is absolutely vital here. There are really, again, 4 or 5 key things that seem to come up really commonly. Communication absolutely is vital. Communicating in ways that make people feel understood and respected, and that includes in their own language. I just briefly, if you'll indulge me, I made a mistake when I worked in family violence of initially thinking all of these resources that I was working on in Queensland government that were pamphlets about getting people to get help for family violence, all we needed to do was just translate those resources. Boom, they're accessible to everybody, and everybody is therefore equal in their access to the information about getting help. And I was really wrong. Thankfully, I engaged in some groups with the Vietnamese community, the Pacifica community, and the Vietnamese community said to me, you know, this business about getting counselling, do you know what that means to us in our culture when you say go and get counselling? It means you think there's something psychologically wrong with my brain and that I'm the problem.
And I think the essence that I got of that, Natalie, is that the messages themselves need understanding from a cultural context, not just translation of the language. So the whole nuance of the message and the direction of the message in translated material could be quite culturally unsafe, if I understood that correctly.
You did. And I guess what I would also add to that, I would not have known that that was going to be a problem had I not engaged with the community itself. Engaging with that specific culture was vital for me to understand how to communicate with older people coming from that culture into my service. And at the end of the day, that is more than just mandatory training. Look, the other things really related to how vital food is for people who, when they're in care and there's not much else going on in their lives, if we are not enabling that community and cultural access, food is just becomes so much more important as we grow older as well. And culturally recognisable food is really important as well. And that's more than just nursing care. That's about having people around us who are from our culture as well. And now I'm speaking firsthand.
That engagement is really critical. And I know that there's a requirement now to have consumer advisory bodies, and we hear all the time some of them work well, some of them don't. Some of them don't work well for the providers, and some of them don't work well for older people themselves. This is something that we want to do. So we want to engage with providers, and we'll engage with older people to try and actually find ways to make that more meaningful and more helpful for both providers, but also more respectful for older people to have their input. And I think that, you know, we can do that across cultures as well, because there will be some things, as Natalie's just beautifully highlighted, that will translate and hit differently based on a different culture or a different diverse group. So looking at all of those things, we'll be reaching out to people and and hopefully working with you to try and develop some resources and some ways to make that work better, so that older people are actually heard and you're actually getting the information that you need to support you to make these changes.
It's really beholden upon providers to make sure that they've got very good representation of different people from different, representing different areas of diversity in those consumer advisory bodies of their organisations, and that we really have to work hard to make sure that people for whom English is not a first language, even sometimes often for their family members, it's not their first language, to make sure that they're included, because that is critical to getting the whole provision of culturally safe care right, actually having those people involved.